Thanks for joining us for the KC Ready For's 10 Videos to Celebrate 10 Years campaign. We hope you enjoy this interview about the importance of quality in pre-K programs with author of The Most Important Year, Suzanne Bouffard. The conversation was led by supporter and former board member Shirley Johnson and Western Michigan University education professor and board member Dr. Regina Nelson.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Suzanne Bouffard. I'm a writer and researcher. I have a background and a doctorate in child development and early childhood, and made the transition to writing about research and best practice.
So, Suzanne, as I mentioned earlier, I loved the book, and we're just wondering what compelled you to take on this initiative to write this book about the importance of early childhood and quality pre-K.
I decided to write the book when I started visiting classrooms, potential classrooms for my oldest child. And at that point, I had been doing research on early childhood education for several years. And I knew that there was a gap between what we know is best practice and what was actually happening in classrooms. But I was still really surprised when I saw it for myself. And I was particularly surprised that there was variation in quality across classrooms in the same district and even in a resourced district. So I realized that even teachers and administrators didn't have access to the information that I did from the research world about what we know good programs should be. The other thing I realized was that parents were stressed and anxious and didn't know what to look for and what to ask. And I noticed a lot of parents were asking questions about things that weren't necessarily important, things about how the physical space looked and that sort of thing, or the schedule that might be important to families' lives, but that aren't necessarily important for child development. And then I saw other families who were just really overwhelmed and didn't know what to do. And I decided to write the book so that other parents and other teachers would have access to the information that I did, and so that it wouldn't have to be such a stressful process to find a preschool program for your child. Because we should be in a place where no parent has to be anxious and stressed about where to send their child for preschool, because every classroom should be a great classroom.
Thank you. In your book, you discuss multiple different ways and times about the importance of developing in these preschool years, executive functioning, critical thinking skills, social emotional regulation. So I'm wondering if you can maybe explain to the people who will be viewing this why those skills are so critical for a child's success in education and actually even beyond in life.
Early childhood is such an exciting and fundamental time in a child's development, and it really lays the foundation for everything that comes after. And one early childhood program director in New York City put it really well when she said to me, "You can't build a house starting on the second floor. You have to lay a solid foundation first." And over the last couple of decades, we've learned so much from neuroscience about all the connections that are forming in young children's brains and what that process looks like. So the way that the brain develops is that there's a ton of growth going on in the earliest years. And if you take advantage of that and you encourage that development and you provide all kinds of cognitive stimulation and physical stimulation for kids, then those neural pathways get cemented and they exist forever. But there's a use it or lose it phenomenon that goes on. And so the neural pathways that don't get used get pruned away and don't become a part of the child's developing brain forever. So it's a real critical window of opportunity for cognitive skills, executive functioning skills like planning and memory and self-control and all of those things. But brain development isn't the only reason that the early childhood years are so important. First of all, it's a really important time for social and emotional development. Everyone who's been around young children knows that and how they are exploring their social world and developing. And so classrooms really give kids an opportunity to develop those skills in a way that they wouldn't necessarily at home or in their community. And that's not to say that what they're doing at home and in the community isn't important. It's just to say that there are certain opportunities that exist in classrooms that are really helpful to build on those other things. But I often say the most important thing about the early childhood years is that they lay a foundation for children to become lifelong learners. Young children are naturally curious and they're naturally learners, but a good early childhood classroom nurtures that and continues to foster that. And it helps children see themselves as learners, identify themselves as learners, and develop some of the skills that are going to help them learn. And that's things like asking questions and getting along with others and learning about how exciting reading is and nature walks are and all of those kinds of things. So it really helps kids from a very early age understand the world is mine to explore and establishes a foundation for them to do that for the rest of their lives.
So one thing that a quick add-on to that, when I read the book, I loved how you really made parents feel comfortable that their kid does not need to know how to read to start kindergarten. And I think sometimes we do get so wrapped up in what kids know versus learning how to learn, really, or developing that skill of learning. So I love that you emphasize that, because I think when families are looking at preschools and they see, oh, Johnny could read before he started kindergarten, that really is not the primary focus that we should be worried about. And also that with the whole learning of literacy skills, that the relevance part of how when kids, see a word and can read the word, but it doesn't mean anything to them, that you really have to have that relevance included. So
that's exactly right. A young child who loves reading and loves books and who's starting to play with language, with rhymes and with identifying letters, that child is going to be motivated and have the foundational skills that will allow them to become a reader. And I often use the metaphor of when children learn how to walk. When you're a first-time parent and your child isn't walking yet, and one of their little peers started walking at 10 months, and here you are 14 months and your child isn't walking. Except in very rare situations of physical or developmental delays, every child learns how to walk. And a year later, it really doesn't matter whether they started walking at 10 months or 16 months. And in some ways, reading is like that. We want to get to a point by around second or third grade where they have a solid foundation of reading, but there's no advantage to being a fluent reader the day you turn 5 versus the day you finish first grade when you're 6.5 or 7. So you're exactly right. What you want to see in a classroom is teachers who are encouraging children to be engaged in the learning process, not focused on the product of what that process is. They don't need to know they don't need to know a certain set of words. They don't need to know a certain set of math facts. What they do need to understand is the process. So for example, with math, when you see great classrooms, they really engage kids in thinking about math. How do I know that this is a square? How do I know that this is a triangle? Or, what does it mean to start with 3 and count on from there? If a kid has those kind of skills, they'll develop the more sophisticated skills later. But the problem-solving piece of it is much harder to build later if you don't set the foundation first.
Thank you. I'll let Regina ask a few questions now.
Sure, I want to talk about quality. You outlined some specifics of what you mean by quality. Can you share what quality looks like?
One helpful distinction is that researchers talk about structural quality and process quality. And structural quality is the things that you can observe easily in a classroom, like the number of kids, the ratio of adults to children, safety features, whether everybody's washing their hands. And those things are important, but they're mostly important insofar as they set the stage for what we call process quality. And that's the stuff that is happening between teachers and kids. And that's what really matters. So what quality looks like is a teacher who is really engaged with children, who's listening and asking open-ended questions and having extended dialogue with kids, who's pushing their thinking to go a little bit further, and who's really scaffolding their social and emotional skills. So I sometimes give people some sort of heuristics of things to look for. So for example, you want to see a teacher who's telling children how to behave and why, not what not to do. So instead of don't run or don't touch that, it would be use your walking feet, or it's not safe for us to be touching that, or we'll have time later to touch that, but now's not the right time. Those kinds of empathic interactions with kids are a really good indicator that teachers are tuned into them and they know what's actually going to promote kids' social and emotional development. So that's the main driver of quality, is teachers and the relationship between teachers and kids, and among kids as well. So quality also looks like a teacher helping two children who are arguing over a toy to learn how to share it, not yelling at them for not sharing it or punishing them by sending one of them off to the corner of the room, but explaining everybody's going to get a turn. How about if we set a timer and you can have 5 minutes and then you can have 5 minutes, and they take the time to go through those steps. Also, with the kinds of learning activities that kids are doing, you want to see kids exploring. They should be allowed to touch. They should be allowed to explore their environment. And a big one that I always tell people to look for is to look for the individuality of kids in the classroom. Obviously, you want to make sure that it's a safe environment and that it's an engaging environment, but look for books, make sure there are lots of books, make sure that it's a child-friendly environment. When my kids were in preschool, I used to sometimes wish that we lived in a preschool classroom, because it would be so much easier if the sink was at their height and if there wasn't stuff everywhere that they shouldn't touch. And so a well-organized and child-centered classroom is really important for young kids. If there's stuff that kids shouldn't be playing with, it should be put away in bins. I remember going to an open house for a preschool, and on one of the tables, there were crayons and paper. And after my son had sat down and did some drawing, once he walked away, the teacher kind of got a scowl on her face, and she went over and she took the supplies and put them away on a shelf. And my husband observed this, and he came up to me and he said right away, "This is not the place for us."
Yeah, thank you for the example. So throughout your book, you give many examples, and two of the recommendations you discussed most when sharing the story of pre-K teachers in the Boston public school systems were the importance of curriculum and teacher mentors. And we were excited about this because this is a huge focus of the work of KC Ready Fours. So for people who haven't read the book, can you talk about how effective this has been for the field?
It's been really important for people to understand not just what quality looks like, but how you build it. And part of that is about the capacity of staff members to be great teachers and to facilitate these positive interactions with kids. People often ask me, why should teachers need more training, or why should they need mentoring after they've already gone to college? First of all, we know that early childhood educators have a range of backgrounds and experience and education levels. But even for a teacher who's gotten a bachelor's degree or maybe a master's degree, or maybe even has been in the classroom for a year or two, there is so much development that can and should happen in a teacher's career over time. When you think about, for those of us who have young children or have had young children in our lives, when you think about all the things that they can throw at you that you did not see coming, and then you magnify that by 15 or 17 or 20, you start to get an inkling of what it's like to be a teacher in an early childhood classroom, full of kids with individual needs, and every class and every child is a little bit different. And no matter where you are in your career as a teacher, you're going to face situations that you've never faced before. And you're going to meet kids that you've never met before. You add on top of that the fact that teaching young children is a very in-the-moment experience. You plan, of course, a good teacher plans, but in the moment, you have to be a little bit in reaction mode. And having a mentor and having a coach really allows teachers to step back and reflect on what's been happening in the classroom. So it gives them another set of eyes to say, okay, what was happening with all those 17 kids when I and my co-teacher were in the classroom, and how can we do this even a little bit better? So usually, like in Boston, the instructional coaches who work with the early childhood teachers have been early childhood educators for many years, and they have developed so many amazing strategies for managing conflicts in the classroom, setting up routines, helping kids who are struggling, helping teachers embed more literacy and more questioning in the classroom. So that's really invaluable. I remember, for example, one coaching session that I watched. The teacher was a really good teacher, and she was talking about, she was setting up a painting activity, and she was walking the kids through some of the do's and don'ts of the activity. And her coach pointed out that she was saying to kids, she was giving them directions that were very sort of closed-ended and yes/no questions. So she would say to them, "Are we going to do this?" And the kids would all chorus, "No." "Are we going to are we going to drop lots and lots of paint on the paper all at once?" "No." And the coach pointed out to her, the kids would process that better, and they would actually follow the guidelines more if she asked them an open-ended question, like, what do you think is going to happen if you drop a whole lot of paint on here at once? And this was a good teacher, but in the moment, you don't hear yourself saying those things. And so the job of a coach, a good coach, is not to be critical, but to be that kind of second set of eyes and ears who can help you develop those things. And certainly, I think anybody who's been a parent can relate to how difficult it is with your own children and, a whole classroom of kids. Teachers really need and deserve all the support they can get. So that's been really helpful for the field to understand the importance of that kind of support. The curriculum piece has also been really important. And there's sometimes a misconception when we use the word curriculum that people envision what you might see in a 4th or 5th grade classroom, a set of very structured activities, a textbook, a workbook. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about curriculum for early childhood. In early childhood, what we're talking about is an intentional sequence of themes and activities that build on each other over time. And the Boston Public Schools have developed their own curriculum. It's really rich. It's embedded in great quality children's literature and activities and explorations that you can do tied to the literature and to themes. And what that does is it allows for deeper exploration of a topic and of, for example, a book, than would be the case if you were just kind of cobbling together activities that sounded interesting. But maybe even more important than that, it builds on kids' skills over time. So you know that you've gone over certain fundamental math concepts. You know that you've gone over, a few key letters that maybe are in the child's name, for example. So those are fundamental to them, and they can build on that over time. Because researchers have identified a clear progression, for example, with math, of how kids develop an understanding of numbers and counting. And so if you build a curriculum around that, it really allows kids to develop those skills in a continuous way. Now, a good classroom is flexible. A good classroom has choices for teachers and for kids about how to implement that curriculum. A curriculum for young children should never be strict or inflexible. But we also know that it's not as helpful for kids' long-term development if it's just kind of a little bit of this, a little bit of that. This is what we feel like doing on this particular day.
Wonderful. In your opinion, what are the biggest challenges to quality?
I think the biggest challenge to quality is the funding and the willingness to support teacher development and professional learning. As I said before, it's such an important part of quality, and it's expensive. First of all, there's not a lot of incentive for teachers to go into early childhood education. The pay tends to be low, the working conditions are not always great. Very few early childhood educators have paid time off and other benefits that the parents of some of their students would consider to just be standard. They're not for early childhood educators. So you bring people into a profession that many of them are doing for the love of it and not because it's a particularly lucrative thing to do. Some of those people haven't really had the opportunity to have higher education, or they don't pursue higher education because the economics of it don't work out. You can't pay off your student loans as an early childhood teacher in a community-based setting. Even for teachers who do, as we talked about, the ongoing development and support is really important, just like it's really important to have multiple adults in the classroom. One of the things that I observed when I was in classrooms was how much 1 or 2 children with self-regulation challenges can completely change the tenor of the classroom and derail everything that the teacher is trying to do. If you have a child who's acting out, who's loud, who's physical, it's very difficult to conduct the activities with the class that you want to do. As I said before, I think a lot of people go into the profession because they really have a passion for it and they love children. But we're not necessarily attracting our best and brightest because we've looked down on this profession as a society and not seen it for what it is, which is incredibly challenging and stimulating and important. Last week, I heard a talk by Tabitha Rossbroy, who's the CCSSO Teacher of the Year. And she's the first Teacher of the Year to be an early childhood educator, which is really exciting for our field. And one of the things she said is that people often ask her, well, now don't you want to move up? Don't you want to do something more challenging and work with older kids? And her response was, no. This is so challenging. This is so fulfilling. This is what I've chosen to do. It's not a stepping stone to something else. And so we need to really reframe what the profession of early childhood education is. And if there's anything potentially good to come out of this pandemic that we're in, I do think that parents and business people and the society at large are starting to value teachers more than they ever have before, to know how difficult the job is, and also to understand that it's so much more than babysitting. Never mind the fact that babysitting 17 children would be enough of a challenge. So I hope that we have kind of a window of opportunity right now to build on that and to cultivate a long-term investment in what I hope will become a higher status profession and have the sort of respect that it's always deserved.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of how high quality preschool programs really decrease the educational opportunity gap that exists between children from low-income households compared to those of middle or upper-class households.
We talked about how important early childhood programs are as a foundation for learning, and for far too long, some children have had more access to that foundation than others. And the kids who are most at risk in a large number of ways, everything from health and nutrition to communities that are safe, have historically had less access to early childhood programs as well. Middle income and higher income children tend to have a lot more access to educational toys, art supplies, access to cultural institutions like museums, as well as high quality preschool programs. So what you do is you kind of compound the advantages for these children. And so that when kids start kindergarten and first grade, I don't like to use the word behind. I think it's more that some kids have been given an advantage, sort of a boost of where they're starting. And so providing everyone a high quality early childhood experience can start to level that playing field a little bit and help everybody to have a solid foundation so that we're not having to talk about achievement gaps at kindergarten in the same way that we do now. It's important to recognize that early childhood programs cannot solve all of society's problems and cannot single-handedly solve inequity. So we're really setting ourselves up to fail if we say that by investing in early childhood programs, we expect that every 5-year-old is going to start kindergarten in the same place. We know that's simply not true when some kids don't have a safe place to live. They don't have space at home. They don't have access to books. But we can get them closer, and we can get them to some of the basic enrichment and thinking opportunities that they deserve.
So a little bit of a follow-up on that, because I think a lot of, and kind of related back to the previous conversation of funding. Funding is, the biggest challenge to quality. And, as we look for any community to understand the importance of this, and also not just by intellectually understanding it, but by funding it, and often people think, well, unfortunately, what's in it for me? But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to, and you highlighted a little bit in your book as well, that, once kids have more exposure, I like that you don't talk about it as them being behind, but once they do have an opportunity to have more exposure, how it really lifts everyone up. When you're going into a kindergarten classroom, and I've chatted with kindergarten teachers who say, there's often such a spread that if you can be on a little more level playing field for moving forward, there's a tremendous difference in a classroom where, not that everyone's at the same level, but there's a tremendous advantage to everyone being able to move forward in a little easier fashion.
That's exactly right. You can look at it both in short-term and long-term ways. So thinking from the perspective of a teacher or a school in kindergarten or first grade, it is very common for there to be a really wide spread of exposure that kids have had and of places where they're starting. So if everybody has that foundation, it's much easier and more possible for the teacher to take everybody on a more accelerated track and allow everyone to progress more quickly. We know that teachers have to spend extra time with kids who either aren't used to a classroom setting and need more support on the behavioral expectations, or kids who've maybe never identified the letters in their name before. If a teacher doesn't have to do that with some kids, then she can move everybody along faster. But there's an equivalent of this in the longer term too. I remember when I first started writing the book, hearing Barack Obama on a podcast talking about how the investment in other people's children in the long term is going to make society a more stable, better place to live. That if everybody has enough, and if everybody has an education, we can address some of the problems of poverty and crime and things that affect all of us. I think it is becoming clearer and clearer, even to people who didn't acknowledge this in the past, that we can't live in our own little bubbles, even people who have a lot of wealth and privilege, that we are all interconnected, whether we like it or not. Some of us like it a lot, and some people maybe don't. But even if you don't, you can't deny that everyone's success or failure affects everyone else's in some large societal way. So I hope that we're getting to a place of understanding that, particularly in early childhood, if you make that investment in everyone, you don't have to make as much of an investment later. And there is some research that suggests that there's a cost savings in terms of things like incarceration and public assistance and those other kinds of social safety net programs if you get kids off on the right foot early.
Thank you. You talked about part of the reason that you were compelled to write this book was, that it is agonizing for parents when they're trying to figure out what program to put their children in. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate. You cover this in your book with some great examples. The one thing I do love about your book is for every thought you're throwing out there, you have examples that really firm up what your message is. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the benefits of both having public and private preschool options. And the one thing that we as KC Ready Fours are very proud of is the fact that we have this network for the private providers, but we very much partner with the public providers because we don't want that to become an obstacle or a challenge when they're trying to figure out what works best for them. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate on a little bit why we as a community, do need both options for families.
It is really important, and the public and the private sector in early childhood are really interwoven in a way that is very positive, or can be if we support everyone to do it well. First of all, different families have different needs. So some families are looking for 10-hour-a-day care for their young children. Other families are looking for a part-time program, and then the child can either be in family care or with a sitter or something like that. So community-based programs tend to have more extended hours. They might be more accessible in terms of neighborhood. They tend to be year-round. A lot of times they provide multiple meals a day. And some people also feel that a community-based program tends to hire staff who are reflective of that community. Maybe they're more likely to speak the language of parents who are using their services, and be culturally similar in other ways that can create more family engagement and more comfort. Schools, public schools, part-time Head Start programs, those sorts of things also have their own wonderful advantages, including the infrastructure for quality, and federal funding and state funding and support. They tend to have training requirements for staff that can help to boost quality. And they're also really great options. So different families have different needs, and communities have different needs. So that's important. But one of the things I learned when I was writing the book that I hadn't understood before was about the economics of how early childhood programs work. So the youngest children in an early childhood center are the most expensive to serve, because if you think about a classroom of infants, you need to have more adults per child than you do when, say, kids are 4 years old. So the 4-year-olds essentially subsidize the younger children in the centers. They make it possible for centers to afford that. If you were to take all of the 4-year-olds, maybe even all of the 3-year-olds, and move them into a public setting, like move them into public schools, you then have the infrastructure of infant and toddler care collapse, because there's no longer the subsidy of the funding that you had from families or from government subsidies for those older kids. And that's happening in many communities. Even pre-pandemic, we were seeing a lot of places discontinue their infant and toddler programs, or have to close altogether when a lot of kids started going into the public school system. There's also trade-offs in terms of situating early childhood programs in public schools. I think that we're getting to a place where more and more administrators and teachers in a school setting understand early childhood and what's developmentally appropriate. But 10 years ago, when we started seeing preschool programs in public school buildings, that wasn't necessarily the case. And so some of those classrooms were not as child-friendly and developmentally appropriate as we would want them to be. But for all these different reasons, it makes a lot of sense to have a system that's both public and private, that's located in schools and in communities to offer all these different things that families need. And there are some communities that are doing some really innovative things to blend the funding streams. For example, I know in Washington, D.C., they have blended their Head Start funding with their public school funding so that some of the requirements are the same and some of the funding is the same regardless of what door you enter to go to preschool. So those kinds of efforts, and I know you all are doing a lot of really great work in this area as well, are really important. But there's no single, unlike K-12 education, there's really no sort of single place that it makes sense for early childhood to be.
Great. Thank you.
So in the conclusion of your book, you write how one of the most critical funding needs is for families who are just above the federal Head Start threshold. Again, we are excited because this is what KC Ready For is focused on. We help with that population. Can you explain that to folks who don't have young children in the preschool system currently?
Early care and education is very expensive. And at the same time, early childhood providers are still, in many cases, not being paid a living wage. And a lot of people have a really hard time reconciling those two things in their head because it's so expensive for families. It's expensive for families regardless of how much money you make. But there are communities and families in this country who are paying a third of their income to childcare or more. And that is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for parents. And it doesn't help parents to stay in the workforce, to develop their careers. Certainly doesn't help them to create a stable home situation and family situation. At the same time, centers, as we've talked about, are really struggling financially. So I think until there is some form more public investment than we have now, and potentially more room from the private sector as well to pay into that system, there's going to continue to be this gap where the system is not working financially for anyone. But in terms of the specific gap that you mentioned, it is a real area of need because children below a certain income threshold, whose families fall below a certain income threshold, are eligible for certain federally funded programs. And then children at another end of the spectrum, their families can afford out of their own incomes to pay. And it might be a little painful, but they're going to be okay. But there is a group of children, really at-risk children in the middle, whose families absolutely can't afford to pay to send them to one of these programs. And so, but they aren't eligible because they make too much money. Or in some cases, there are other requirements. There are requirements for certain city and state programs about where you live. Maybe your parent has to be working full-time or in school. There are a lot of eligibility criteria. We also know we have lots of undocumented young children. So there are a lot of young children who sort of fall into this gap. And most of those kids are in family care with family members, or maybe in a family child care home setting where a neighbor is providing care for a few children. And I think one of the positive trends I've seen in the last several years is more and more support and professional learning for home-based providers so that everybody can sort of have that level of quality and have a good experience regardless of where they are. But until we really figure out how to deal with that funding gap and make sure that everybody has access, we will continue to have kids who fall through the cracks. It's going to take a lot of creativity and commitment to figure that out because we talked about the importance of having a mixed delivery system where there are both public and private entities. You can't simply just say, great, we're going to put all the 3 and 4-year-olds in public school and that'll solve it. But that is a part of the puzzle. And I think we all have to be willing to do the hard work to say, this is going to be complicated, but how are we going to make it work for our community and look at it as a system, not just as an individual program.
Mm-hmm. So to expand on that one, only 3% of education funding in the U.S. goes to early childhood education. So we all agree that providing more funding for preschool is needed, as you explained. What is the best model for increasing access to high quality preschool programs for all families?
Well, I wish I had the magic answer. I wish I knew exactly. Fortunately, I think that there are people who are a lot more skilled and in this financial area than I am, who are working on solutions. But as I said before, I think that it needs to be some kind of combination of public investment and private investment. I was talking to a longtime early childhood leader in the Boston area where I live, and she was talking about how in our area we have a lot of biotech companies, we have a lot of industry, we have a lot of highly paid industry, and that those companies are getting the advantage of early childhood care and education and not paying into the system. And her point was that we need to think a little more creatively about the role that the private sector can play. We see universities doing this, but outside of universities, what other things can companies do beyond simply having a daycare in their building for their own employees? I think it comes back to this notion about seeing it as a system and thinking of ourselves as a community and how it's all interconnected and the funding affects everybody. So I'd love to see some more creative thinking about public-private partnerships.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think businesses, usually are focused on a little more their immediate needs. And, what I always tell anybody that will listen, that, I think what supporting early childhood does is it not only supports your current workforce, because chances are your workforce has challenges trying to get their kids into quality programs that they can afford. And those kids are their future workforce. So there's truly, I wish there was more private knocking on our doors saying, yes, yes. So I agree.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about the future, when you step back and think about our field and the future of early childhood education, what gives you hope?
I think one of the things that really makes me hopeful is the increased recognition of the value of the field and people beginning to recognize just how important this work is and how difficult it is. People are also starting to really recognize the financial squeeze and the gap that exists, that it's so hard for parents to pay, and yet it's so hard for educators to make a commitment to this profession where they're not making enough money and they're not getting the benefits that they need to be healthy and stable people.
No,